Our next presenter comes to us from UNC, Anndal Narayanan, who is working on his dissertation under the supervision of Don Reed at UNC. He is a historian of the social and political history of 20th century France, and he is working on a dissertation that looks at the reintegration and the experiences and political movements of Algerian war veterans in the period from 1956 to 1974. And today he will be presenting the paper entitled Ready to Fight, Veterans of the Algerian War Take the Battle to France, 1958 to 1974.
Oh, pardon me for that. Unfortunately, my technical expertise was not up to putting on my single slide, which I made with great care last night, but I think I can get along without it. Well, thank you. Since I'll be making frequent reference to a bunch of acronyms of veterans associations, I thought I would begin by just giving a brief overview of them, hopefully to avoid confusion. So to begin with, I look at the UNCAFN, which stands for the Union Nationale des Anciens Combattants d'Afrique du Nord. This was founded in 1957 and leaned to the nationalist far right, but its successor association today is more center-right nationalist, still very militarist. This association grew rapidly during the war. It already had about 10,000 members in 1958 and grew to almost 200,000 by 1961. Second, I examine the FNACA, which stands for the Fédération Nationale des Anciens Combattants en Algérie, Maroc et Tunisie, which was founded in 1958 by the famous journalist Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, in fact. And this group stood on the anti-colonialist left, but it became more centrist since the end of the war. And this group grew very slowly during the war and immediately afterwards. It only had about 20,000 members in 1967 and would only really reach a critical mass of about 200,000 members in the early 1970s. And lastly, I look at the UDAA, which stands for l'Union démocratique des Anciens d'Algérie. And this group was founded a bit later in 1961. And its political orientation was non-communist democratic centrism. Since very few documents remain on this association, I've been unable to determine its membership, but I did learn that it had 42 departmental chapters by 1962, so it was growing very rapidly in its first year of existence. So my paper focuses on these three associations, all of which emerged during the war itself and sought to give meaning to the sacrifices of a generation of French soldiers and also channel their energy in a certain political direction. The FNACA and the UNCAFN, so the leftist and the rightist associations, have continued in various forms to this day, whereas the UDAA, the centrist Democrats, vanished by 1964. So, as I did my research last year, I was baffled as to why the centrist group, indeed the group with the most developed and ambitious politics, as I'll discuss in a bit, disappeared soon after the war's end, and only the associations with the most polarized politics were able to survive. So in this paper, I sought to unravel this mystery, as well as to determine the long-term effects that these associations had in French civil society. So, regardless of political orientation, these associations seeking to group Algerian war veterans had a common problem, which was that these veterans formed an invisible generation. The war produced a coherent generational experience. All Frenchmen born between 1932 and 1945 were subject to be drafted, and indeed over 1 million young Frenchmen were conscripted, combining with professional soldiers to make over 2 million soldiers deployed in the Algerian War on the side of France. 1/4 of all French families in the metropole had a son down there, so it had a very deep impact in French society. Nevertheless, neither veterans nor their war could be recognized for a long time for a number of reasons. The first is that the war could only officially be considered the pacification of a rebellion or peacekeeping operations since Algeria was juridically, on paper, part of France. Secondly, to many World War veterans in society at large and the government, the kids doing their national military service down in Algeria didn't seem like real veterans. They weren't fighting an invading force. Thirdly, metropolitan society moved from indifference to outright disdain regarding these soldiers and their war. But most importantly, and as Benjamin Stora succinctly put it in a phrase I probably overuse, the French Fifth Republic was ashamed of its birth from the chaos of a military coup in Algiers in 1958. Especially after the war, Gaullist memory sought to minimize the fact that Charles de Gaulle had been returned to power on the promise of saving French Algeria. So for all these reasons, de Gaulle and his ministers forcefully rejected the notion that Algeria was a war and that the young Frenchmen serving there were veterans. And it was against this backdrop of silence and ambivalence and repression that veterans associations had to function. And they were obliged to frame their raison d'être in competing moral imperatives against this backdrop. To begin with, the UNC-AFN sought foremost to defend the dignity of the army and build support for French Algeria in the metropole. Its co-founder and longtime president, François Porteau de la Morandière, told me last year that he and his colleagues, quote, were ready to fight to defend the memory of our dead comrades. Secondly, the FNACA opposed the war on moral grounds, as well as those who supported it, including the UNC-AFN. Its founder, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, declared at the group's first Congress that the war strongly prejudices the prestige of France. And this association sought to end the war in order to save the traditions of France and its army. Thirdly, the UDAA also took it as a moral duty to end the war, but it further distinguished itself by warning against the machinations of the UNC-AFN, which it denounced as a bunch of fascists, and the FNACA, which it alleged was under communist domination. So this third association sought to create a union of Democrats to fight what it perceived as these two extremes in the veterans movement. Very early in their existence, all three of these associations presented veterans as political actors, citizens who deserved to testify and engage on political matters. The UNC-AFN tended to portray the generation of veterans as citizens who had been wronged by the government, who deserved a corrective role in politics to prevent future mistakes. This group's rhetoric went from hopeful to desperate as support for French Algeria decreased in society. So it went from making statements like, veterans of North Africa, the future of the country depends on your bearing witness, to later making statements such as, wait another couple of years and you will see our generation rise up, but make no mistake, we will be merciless. The FNACA also portrayed veterans as a generation of wronged citizens who deserved to testify, but the wrong in this case, in their view, was having been sent to fight a war that was unjust in the first place. This group's rhetoric moved from the position of a voice crying out in the wilderness to a position of increased confidence as opposition to the war grew. The association insisted that the war was against nature and that the generation marked by this war has the right and the duty to make its voice heard, to play a role in the future of the country. Lastly, the UDAA, like the FNACA, gave a political role to vets because it viewed the war as immoral. However, this group had by far the most ambitious veterans politics of all these associations, calling for, quote, an action of education and civic formation for young veterans, students, and youth movements, end quote. On top of that, its program also called for a comprehensive restructuring of the armed forces, the transformation of national military service into a civic corps, and perhaps its eventual abrogation, and finally, Franco-Algerian technical cooperation. So quite a program there. The end of the war in 1962 led all three associations to somewhat change their focus while retaining their founding visions of the citizen soldier. The FNACA turned to campaigns of rights and recognition because it held that the state owed veterans for the damage done to them and their families. The UNC-AFN focused primarily on commemorations, perpetuating this bitter memory of the abandonment of Algeria, and continued to portray veterans as a civic elite who needed to testify on political matters. Finally, the UDAA turned to the immediate problems of reintegrating the young conscripts, especially in the domains of education and work. So, in positioning veterans as worthy political witnesses, these associations were following a precedent set in France by veterans of the Great War, many of whom loudly criticized the parliamentary politics of the Third Republic. But through the Algerian period as well, the army was strongly politicized until de Gaulle purged it. Politicized officers and career military were strongly present in the conservative, nationalist, militaristic UNC-AFN. But the leadership and members of the leftist anti-colonialist FNACA were often quite politicized as well in this period, as it is natural that, that leftist veterans would self-select into an anti-war, anti-colonialist association. Thus, it's not unusual that veterans of Algeria would seek a political voice and role in this period, but what I do find unusual is the circumstances under which they did so. For several decades, veterans' politics had required delicate navigation in France. After the February 6, 1934 anti-government riot, and then Pétain's Légion Française des Combattants during World War II, veterans associations were wary of seeming too political. And in the more immediate Cold War context, leftist veterans associations were easily dismissed as attempts at communist manipulation. But most important, the Constitution of the French Fifth Republic stacked the deck against veterans associations as well as other pressure groups in civil society pushing for legislation. The Constitution located executive power in the president rather than in Parliament. The government held precedent over elected deputies in the National Assembly sessions and could veto proposals for the day's agenda. What this means is that veterans associations had to contend with de Gaulle and his ministers, who were not keen to listen to the appeals of young men who had fought a war they would rather not be reminded of. In this context, both the leftist and rightist veterans associations presented their political action and speech as civic or apolitical. The UNC-AFN, for instance, described itself as, quote, apolitical by statute, but national in its form, spirit, and action, end quote. This association reserved the right to take an interest in state affairs, as it frequently would. The FNACA's statutes, similarly, quote, affirmed its independence from civil and military authorities and all political parties, end quote. But the association maintained it could not be neutral, since that would preclude militancy for veterans' rights. However, the UDAA did not face similar constraints, since it emerged as the April 1961 putsch and the rise of the terrorist OAS, quote, transformed the war into a subject of interior French politics. This association was unabashedly political. As one of its members wrote, being apolitical doesn't mean anything. What must be avoided is being partisan. In 1964, Le Monde listed the UNC-AFN, the FNACA, and the UDAA as, quote, the three associations of veterans of Algeria. But this seems to have been the last year of the UDAA's formal existence. The UDAA lacked a discrete mobilizing ideology like the UNC-AFN's pro-French Algerian nationalism, nor did it have a concise, easily explained campaign for concrete results like the FNACA's fight for veterans recognition. The UDAA also lacked institutional support that the other associations benefited from. For instance, the FNACA was supported by the CGT and other leftist groups, and the UNC-AFN was initially funded by the Defense Ministry. But most importantly, I find the UDAA proposed a highly politicized vision of veterans to a scarce audience. Those veterans who were politically minded and who wanted to join an association in this time were more likely to self-select into either extreme of the veterans movement. After 8 years of an extremely polarizing war for French society, there was very little democratic centrist position remaining. Now, scholars agree that this generation of veterans of Algeria frequently distrusted party politics, investing themselves little in the state. But when members of the Algerian generation did begin to stand for office in the 1980s and 1990s, they benefited from political narratives that veterans associations had been disseminating for decades. The National Front, founded in 1972 by former paratrooper Jean-Marie Le Pen and other former pro-French Algerian militants, found a particularly receptive audience among nationalist veterans. And indeed, the UNC-AFN president, Porte de la Mort Entière, quit his post of the association in 1983 to stand as a National Front candidate. The UNC-AFN and other nationalist veterans associations cultivated an aggrieved veterans memory that justified political action in the present. As for the FNACA, it too cultivated its own memory of the war, but since this association was on the right side of history, against the war and against colonialism from the beginning, it did not have to expend as much energy promoting its own memory and could focus instead on its campaigns for veterans' rights. So to conclude, I'm arguing that circumstances obligated both the UNC-AFN and the FNACA, the rightist and the leftist groups, to modify the definition of politics in order to operate in this period. Despite Gaullist attempts to repress the memory of the war and limit political engagement in civil society, veterans associations cultivated narratives of the war that had already been formed by 1958, forging space for political engagement by young French veterans deeply marked by their Algerian experience. But 8 years of this divisive conflict had rendered a democratic, reconciliatory center impossible by 1962, and thus only the anti-colonialist and nationalist extremes of the veterans movement remained. Thank you.